In the 1970s and 1980s, the whole world went through a severe crisis caused by one energy source, oil. Oil prices skyrocketed, starting with oil produced in the Middle East, which then spread throughout the world. Governments and central banks had to deal with this problem. The origins of the problem, the roots of the issue, actually go all the way back to the Ottoman Empire, which we see here at its height in the 17th century. However, by the time the First World War broke out, the Ottoman Empire was much smaller. It included Bulgaria, Turkey, and parts of other Arab countries. The Ottoman Empire was a declining empire. Everyone knew it. It was about to fall apart, and all the ethnic groups that made it up were about to become independent. England and France attempt one last colonialist move, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, through which France and England try to establish control over the countries of the Middle East. It won't go well, and at the end of the Second World War, the countries will all be more or less independent. As we can see in this table, where we notice that, in fact, in 1948 the State of Israel is created. There isn't a true independence from a former colony, but rather a state created by decision of the United Nations. It wasn't a unanimous decision, however, because some countries didn't agree. Egypt, in particular, was against it and promised that if the State of Israel was established, Egypt would attack it immediately. And that's exactly what happened. On the day the State of Israel was created, Egypt attacked it. This was the first act in a long series of acts of war. The wars we remember are four in total, known as the Arab-Israeli Wars, which began precisely with the Egyptian attack on Israel. These wars also had economic consequences because oil is produced in that region. When Israel is attacked, the oil-producing countries, to show they side with Egypt, decide to impose an embargo, a petroleum embargo against Western countries. Oil will become much more expensive, as we can see on the chart. It's 1974. Oil prices rise for the first time after many years of absolute stability. The world's powerful few knew they could go to bed without a worry at night. And the next morning, oil would have the same price as the day before. Since 1974, that's no longer true. An even worse crisis would come in 1979. We see an even greater increase in oil prices because of a shift in power in the Middle East, but this time the country is different. It's Iran. In Iran, a revolution overthrows the Shah, the former Shah of Persia, Reza Pahlavi, who is forced to flee the country that then becomes an Islamic state, which means that the Quran becomes the law of the land. This new revolution damages many oil wells, which unfortunately leads to a massive reduction in global production. At the time, Iran is the country that produces the most oil in the world. The reduction in oil produced in Iran leads to a price increase, an even bigger increase than what had happened a few years earlier. And despite this, we will see a third event of this kind. At the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, gas and oil, two energy sources that Russia exports worldwide, will see a sharp price increase, just like what happened in the 1970s and 1980s. The reason for this is the opposite of before. This time, it's the purchasing countries that are imposing an embargo on oil produced by Russia. But the economic effect is exactly the same. Prices go up, and not by a little. The price of gas, as we can see in this graph, used to be around 30 euros per megawatt hour and shoots up to over 300 euros per megawatt hour. And when energy prices rise, prices go up everywhere in the world. This is because companies produce goods and services using energy, and that energy then has a cost that gets passed on to the price of finished products. So consumers end up paying for the increase in oil prices through the goods and services they use, of the final goods and services that reach the market to be sold. This strong inflation, caused by rising oil prices, is generally kept in check by central banks by adjusting interest rates. And we need to understand how interest rates affect inflation. So here's how it works. Imagine you have €1 and you need to decide whether to buy something today or not. So let's pretend that at the beginning of the economic framework we're trying to analyze, someone has €1. If they buy a good worth €1, after a certain period of time, let's say at t+1, the good will be worth a bit more, it will cost a bit more. Economists call this increase inflation. If the same person had instead decided to deposit this euro in the bank, so, following the green line, after a certain period of time, they would receive an interest rate, a return. The decision whether to buy the good or deposit the money in the bank depends precisely on the interest rate. If the interest rate is very high, we prefer to deposit our money and not buy. On the other hand, if the interest rate is very low, we prefer to buy the good today. So, if a central bank raises interest rates significantly, it makes it more attractive for economic agents to deposit their money rather than buy goods. At this point, if no one is buying goods, demand decreases and prices should go down. That's how the mechanism works. When a central bank raises interest rates, it hopes that consumers will spend less, so that demand drops and prices go down. But is that really the case? Yes, it really is the case. We can see in this chart that when inflation is very high, interest rates are also very high. And when inflation goes down, the central bank can lower interest rates. This is the historical series for the United States of America, but if we look at the Italian series, we see the same graphical result. When inflation is very high, the Bank of Italy raises interest rates. Today, it's the European Central Bank that does this, not the Bank of Italy anymore. But the economic trend is exactly the same. At this point, we can focus on what happens from the perspective of businesses. They too are influenced by interest rates. But how exactly does this happen? It happens through household consumption. Households decide to consume and therefore buy goods from businesses. Businesses have to produce more. To produce more, they need more capital, more investments, more machines and equipment, which then need to be borrowed. The borrowed capital will have to be paid back with interest. So, if interest rates go up, it's true that households will tend to deposit more money and buy less. But it will also be a problem for businesses to find the necessary funds, which will have to be paid back at a high price to make new investments. So when interest rates go up, the economy tends to slow down and production tends to slow down. Therefore, we all become a little bit poorer. And that's why central banks are so reluctant to raise interest rates and try to do so with extreme caution. So, what have we learned from past crises? We've learned that a sharp, sudden increase in interest rates, just like we saw in the graph from the 1970s and 80s, leads to severe recessions. Today, in 2023, this mistake hasn't been made. Once again, we've learned from the past and we've learned to manage the economy a little bit better. Many years of economic studies have paid off. If any of you will one day end up at a central bank and remember this concept, you could do some good for the world. So, all the best.